Her paws sank into the snow, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she couldn't stop. 3 tiny pups whimpered beneath her, their faint cries swallowed by the merciless howl of the blizzard. Ice clung to her fur, her breaths growing weaker with each step, until a faint glimmer of hope appeared in the darkness. But will she make it to safety, or will the storm steal her last chance? The wind roared like a feral beast, tearing through the skeletal trees and whipping up snow into blinding whirlpools. It lashed against her fur, cutting like icy shards, as if the storm itself reveled in her suffering. The world was a cold, merciless expanse of white, stretching endlessly in every direction. Scarlet lay curled in the snow, her body a frail, trembling shield over her 3 pups. Their tiny forms quivered against her chest, emitting faint, pitiful whimpers that stabbed at her heart. She could feel their fragile breaths against her ribs, each exhale a fading flicker of life. Her instincts screamed at her to keep them warm, to keep them safe, but the biting cold seemed intent on extinguishing the faint hope that still flickered within her. Her once strong legs, now gaunt and weak, were nearly useless. Every muscle ached, every joint stiffened by the unforgiving frost. Hunger gnawed at her insides, like a relentless predator, but she had long since grown numb to it. Every scrap of food she found, rare as it was, had gone to her pups. She could endure the emptiness, the hunger, the pain, as long as they survived. The storm howled louder, and she tightened her body around the pups, shielding them from the icy gusts that threatened to strip away their last remnants of warmth. One of them, a tiny, frail thing with a patch of black fur over its left eye, let out a sharp, plaintive cry. Scarlet turned her head and gently licked its frost-bitten ear, her tongue slow and tender despite the trembling of her own body. The snow around them stretched into infinity, a barren, lifeless wasteland. No shelter, no food, no hope. Scarlet's amber eyes scanned the horizon, desperate to find something, anything, that might offer salvation. Her gaze caught the outline of twisted trees, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. But there was no sign of life, no trace of warmth. A gust of wind hit her hard, nearly knocking her sideways. She tried to stand, her legs wobbling beneath her emaciated frame, but her body refused. She collapsed back into the snow, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. Panic clawed at her chest. If she stopped now, they wouldn't make it through the night. With a force of will she didn't know she had, Scarlet rose again. Her legs trembled violently, but she refused to fall. She gently picked up the smallest pup by its scruff and nudged the other 2 forward with her nose. "Keep moving," her instincts seemed to urge. "Don't stop. Don't give in." Each step was a battle. The snow swallowed her paws, clinging to her fur like icy chains. Her breaths were shallow, each one burning her throat as if she were inhaling shards of glass. Behind her, the pups struggled to keep up, stumbling and whining, their tiny paw prints quickly erased by the relentless storm. Then she smelled it. Faint, almost imperceptible amidst the overwhelming cold, but unmistakable, a wisp of smoke. Her ears perked up, and her heart skipped a beat. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant warmth, and warmth meant life. She turned her head toward the source, her eyes narrowing against the blinding snow. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the storm, was the faintest glimmer of hope. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Scarlet began to move toward the scent. Her paws left deep tracks in the snow as she trudged forward, her body screaming in protest with every step. The pups followed, their tiny cries urging her on. The wind didn't relent, the snow didn't ease, but Scarlet pressed on. She couldn't afford to stop, not now. Not when salvation might be just beyond the next ridge. Each step was a victory, each moment a testament to her determination. But even as she fought, the cold crept deeper into her bones. Her vision blurred, her strength waned. She didn't know if she could make it, but she had no choice. Her pups depended on her, and she would endure any pain, any trial to keep them alive. As the scent of smoke grew stronger, so did her resolve. She pushed forward, each step a triumph of will over despair. And though the storm raged on, somewhere deep inside her, a flicker of hope began to burn. The smoke's faint scent was her lifeline, a thread of hope in a storm determined to break her. Scarlet trudged forward, each step agony. Her paws bled from the jagged ice hidden beneath the snow, her breath ragged in the freezing air. Behind her, the pups struggled to follow, their tiny bodies no match for the deepening drifts. One pup fell, letting out a high-pitched cry. Scarlet dropped the pup in her jaws, turned back, and nosed the fallen one upright. Her heart clenched as she saw its trembling legs, but she urged it forward with a soft whine. She couldn't stop. The smoke was closer now, warmth, safety, survival. The wind lashed at her face, carrying shards of ice that stung her eyes. Her legs shook with exhaustion, but she forced them to keep moving. Each step was slower, harder. Her vision blurred as snowflakes coated her lashes. The pups whimpered, their cries nearly drowned by the storm. Ahead, the outline of a structure emerged, a cabin. Relief surged through her, but the final stretch was the worst. The snow deepened, pulling at her legs like quicksand. She stumbled, her body hitting the ground. For a moment she lay there, panting, the icy cold creeping into her bones. A soft cry from a pup snapped her back. She pushed herself up, fighting the weight of exhaustion. The cabin was so close. She bit down on the scruff of one pup and nudged the others forward, her own body screaming in protest. When she reached the cabin's wall, her legs gave out. She collapsed against the wood, shielding the pups with her body. They huddled close, their tiny breaths warm against her fur. With the last of her strength, she lifted her head and barked, weak, hoarse, but desperate. The sound of footsteps inside froze her. The door creaked open, and light spilled out, blinding after the storm's darkness. A man stood there, his face a mixture of shock and pity. "Oh my God," he whispered, stepping forward. Scarlet locked eyes with him, her gaze pleading. She didn't move, too weak to resist. The pups let out faint cries, pressing closer to her. The man knelt, his hand extending. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." And for the first time in days, she believed it. The warmth hit her like a wave as the man carried her inside. Scarlet's body was limp, her breaths shallow, but she instinctively curled around her pups as he laid them on a worn rug near the fire. The heat from the crackling flames licked at her frostbitten fur, a stark contrast to the icy torment outside. She blinked slowly, her vision hazy, but she could make out the man's silhouette as he moved frantically around the room. The sound of drawers opening, water being poured, and hurried footsteps filled the air. Every noise felt sharp, almost too loud after the muffled silence of the storm. The man returned with a thick blanket, draping it gently over Scarlet and her pups. She flinched at first, her instincts screaming to protect her babies, but her body was too weak to resist. Instead, she laid her head down, her eyes half closed as she watched him cautiously. "You're okay now," he murmured, his voice soft, soothing. He set a bowl of warm water near her and placed a piece of bread beside it. The scent of food made her stomach churn painfully, but she didn't move. She couldn't risk leaving the pups unprotected, not even for a moment. The man seemed to understand. He tore the bread into smaller pieces and placed one near her mouth. Scarlet hesitated, her amber eyes flicking between him and the food. Then, with trembling caution, she stretched her neck and took the offering. The first bite sent a jolt of life through her body. She hadn't realized how close she'd been to collapse until that moment. The man smiled faintly, his relief visible. The pups, still huddled against her, began to stir. Their tiny cries were weak, but persistent, and Scarlet shifted to nuzzle them, reassuring them with gentle licks. The man watched, his expression softening. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he said quietly, crouching a safe distance away. His eyes were full of sorrow as they traced her gaunt frame and frost-covered fur. "But you're here now. You made it." Scarlet didn't fully trust him, not yet, but there was something in his tone, in the way he moved with care, that made her want to believe. Hours passed, and the storm outside raged on, the wind battering against the cabin's walls. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the room. Scarlet began to relax, her body no longer shaking from the cold. The pups nestled closer to her, their tiny breaths warm against her chest. The man brought over a small bowl of milk and gently placed it near the pups. He knelt nearby, watching as one by one they cautiously ventured out from under their mother to lap at the liquid. Scarlet's ears perked slightly, her gaze never leaving him. She was exhausted, but her protective instincts refused to fade entirely. As the pups drank, the man leaned back against the wall, his eyes lingering on Scarlet. "You're a fighter," he murmured. "You didn't give up on them, even when it seemed impossible." Her gaze met his, and for the first time, something inside her softened. The fire's warmth seeped deeper, not just into her body, but into the icy walls she'd built around her heart. The storm outside began to subside, but inside the cabin, a fragile sense of peace had settled. Scarlet rested her head on her paws, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but no longer filled with despair. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, she and her pups were safe. For the first time in what felt like forever, the darkness didn't seem so impenetrable. Dawn broke quietly, the golden light of the rising sun filtering through the frost-covered windows of the cabin. Inside, the fire had burned low, leaving behind a soft, comforting warmth that wrapped around the small family huddled on the rug. Scarlet opened her eyes, her body stiff but no longer trembling from the cold. The pups were nestled against her, their tiny forms rising and falling with steady breaths. For the first time in days, there was silence, no howling wind, no biting chill, only the faint creak of the wooden cabin settling in the morning air. Scarlet lifted her head cautiously, her ears twitching at every sound. Her gaze fell on the man, asleep in a chair by the fire, a blanket draped over his shoulders. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his expression was calm, almost peaceful. She didn't trust easily. The scars of betrayal ran too deep, yet something about this man, his gentle hands, his soft words, made her want to believe. She shifted slightly, nudging one of the pups awake. The little one yawned, its tiny paws stretching before it stumbled toward the bowl of milk left from the night before. The man stirred, blinking awake as the pup let out a small squeak. He sat up slowly, his movements careful, as if afraid to startle them. His eyes met Scarlet's, and he offered a faint smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and kind. He didn't move closer, respecting the fragile trust they had begun to build. Instead, he reached for a loaf of bread and tore off a piece, placing it near her. Scarlet hesitated, her amber eyes locked on his hand. Memories of harsh voices and rough hands flickered in her mind, but she pushed them aside. Tentatively, she stretched her neck and took the bread, her movements slow and deliberate. The man watched her with quiet admiration. "You're stronger than most people I know," he murmured. The pups, emboldened by their mother's calmness, began to explore. They stumbled around the room, their small tails wagging, as they discovered the warmth of the fire and the softness of the rug. The man chuckled softly, his eyes following their clumsy movements, but for Scarlet, every step they took filled her with both pride and fear. The world outside this cabin was still cold, cruel, and unforgiving. She had seen too much, lost too much, to believe otherwise. As the day wore on, the man began to speak to her more, his voice a constant, soothing presence. He told her about the cabin, how it had belonged to his late father, and how he came here to escape the noise of the city. His words were soft, carrying a weight of his own pain, though he didn't say it outright. Scarlet listened, her head resting on her paws. She didn't understand the words, but she felt the emotions behind them, the loneliness, the grief, the need for connection. By evening, the storm had cleared completely, leaving behind a pristine, snow-covered landscape. The man opened the door, letting in a rush of crisp, fresh air. The pups, curious, bounded toward the light, but Scarlet barked softly, calling them back. The outside world still felt too dangerous, too uncertain. The man turned to her, his expression serious. "You can stay here," he said, "as long as you need. I'll take care of you and the little ones." His words hung in the air, heavy with promise. Scarlet studied him, her gaze piercing. She didn't know if she could trust him completely, not yet. But the warmth of the cabin, the kindness in his eyes, and the way he treated her pups with such care, it was more than she had dared hope for. That night, as the pups curled up beside her and the man stoked the fire to keep the room warm, Scarlett allowed herself to relax. She knew the scars of her past wouldn't fade overnight, and the fear of the unknown still lingered. But here, in this small, quiet cabin, she found something she hadn't felt in a long time, a fragile, flickering sense of safety. And for the first time since she'd been abandoned, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had found a place where they could heal,